August 25, 1944. The morning sun broke across the Norman countryside like a blade cutting through fog, illuminating a landscape transformed by war. Along a narrow French road southeast of Chartres, a German reconnaissance officer crouched in the ruins of a stone farmhouse, binoculars pressed against his weathered face. The air smelled of diesel and dust, carried on winds that whispered through fields once golden with wheat, now scarred by tank treads and artillery craters. He was watching for American armor, expecting the pause that military doctrine demanded. The inevitable halt when supply lines stretched too thin, when fuel tanks ran dry, when the momentum of advance surrendered to the tyranny of logistics. But what he saw instead made him lower his binoculars in disbelief. The road below had transformed into a river of motion. Trucks, endless trucks, GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicles rolling bumper to bumper in an unbroken procession, their canvas covers snapping in the wind, their beds loaded with jerry cans of gasoline, crates of ammunition, cartons of rations. The column stretched beyond his sight in both directions, a mechanical serpent that seemed to have no head and no tail, only an eternal body of grinding gears and diesel smoke. The drivers, many of them black American soldiers whose faces he could barely distinguish through the dust, drove with a determined intensity that seemed to mock every principle of German military planning. They drove through day and night, through rain and enemy fire, through exhaustion that would have broken lesser men. This was the Red Ball Express, and it was rewriting the rules of modern warfare 1 mile at a time. In the late summer of 1944, the German High Command faced a paradox that threatened to unravel everything they thought they understood about war. For 5 years, German generals had studied American military capacity with a mixture of contempt and calculated dismissal. They had built their strategic assessments on cold mathematics. The United States might possess industrial might churn out tanks and aircraft in quantities that staggered the imagination, but wars were not won by production alone. Wars were won by discipline, by tactical brilliance, by soldiers forged in the crucible of total commitment. The Americans, they reasoned, were soft, a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers playing at soldiering, led by generals who understood commerce better than combat. And logistics, that unglamorous science of moving supplies from factory to front line, was where American amateurism would reveal itself most completely. German doctrine had elevated logistics to an art form, carefully calculated to support mechanized warfare across vast distances. Their planning emphasized efficiency, precision, the careful husbanding of resources in a nation that had learned through bitter experience the cost of overextension. When they looked at American logistics, they saw improvisation masquerading as system, abundance compensating for incompetence, a nation that tried to solve military problems by throwing resources at them in quantities that offended Prussian sensibility. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, had articulated this contempt in a strategic briefing in early 1944. The Americans, he told his staff officers, understand production but not distribution. They can build 1,000 tanks, but they cannot deliver fuel to 500. It was a sentiment echoed in officers' clubs and planning rooms across occupied Europe, a comfortable assumption that allowed German commanders to believe their tactical excellence could overcome American material superiority. After all, what good were Sherman tanks without gasoline? What use were artillery shells that sat in depots hundreds of miles from the guns that needed them? The German army had demonstrated in Russia the limits of logistics, how the greatest offensive could grind to a halt when supply lines stretched beyond breaking point, when mud and distance and partisan attacks transformed advantage into disaster. Surely the Americans, new to continental warfare, would learn these lessons the hard way. The German generals expected chaos. They expected the American advance to stumble, to pause, to create opportunities for counterattack as fuel shortages and ammunition deficits forced hasty retreats or vulnerable positions. They had seen it happen to their own forces. They expected history to repeat itself on their enemies. But in the aftermath of the Normandy breakout, as American and Allied forces surged across France with a speed that defied pre-war planning, something unprecedented was unfolding. General George S. Patton's Third Army had erupted from the Normandy hedgerows like a force of nature, racing eastward with an audacity that seemed to ignore logistical reality. By late August, Patton's armor had covered distances in days that would have taken weeks in previous wars. liberating vast swaths of French territory and threatening to cut off entire German army groups. The German retreat was becoming a rout, but military logic suggested this could not continue. The Americans had advanced so far, so fast, that their supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of contested territory. Every mile of advance multiplied the logistical burden. More trucks needed to cover greater distances, more fuel consumed in transportation than delivered to the front, more time required for convoys to complete the round trip from supply depots to forward positions. German intelligence calculated that Patton's advance should have collapsed of its own weight by mid-August. The fuel consumption alone was staggering. Third Army was burning through 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day, quantities that seemed impossible to sustain across supply lines that stretched back to the Normandy beaches. Yet somehow impossibly American tanks kept moving, American artillery kept firing, American infantry kept advancing. The supplies were getting through and the Germans could not understand how. What German intelligence had failed to comprehend, what their careful calculations and contemptuous assumptions had blinded them to, was an improvised miracle of logistics that would become legend, the Red Ball Express. It was not elegant. It was not the product of careful Prussian planning or centuries of military tradition. It was American pragmatism at its most audacious, a transportation network built from chaos and necessity, powered by determination and a simple, almost naive faith that what needed to be done could be done. The Red Ball Express was born from crisis on August 25, 1944, the same day that German reconnaissance officer watched those endless convoys roll through the French countryside. With Patton's army racing eastward and fuel shortages threatening to halt the advance, the Allied Logistics Command made a desperate decision. They would create a dedicated highway network, a closed loop of roads reserved exclusively for supply trucks, where convoys could run around the clock without interference from civilian traffic, retreating military units or the normal congestion of military occupation. They would strip every available truck from rear area units, pool vehicles from multiple armies, and create a transportation system unprecedented in scale and intensity. They would name it after the railroad term for express freight trains, and they would bet everything on its success. The statistics alone were staggering enough to challenge belief. In the 83 days the Red Ball Express operated at full capacity, from August 25 to November 16, 1944, it would move approximately 12,193 tons of supplies to forward positions, an average of nearly 5,000 tons per day. The truck fleet eventually grew to include 5,958 vehicles organized into 132 separate truck companies, operating around the clock in a carefully choreographed ballet of motion that consumed highways like a living organism. The trucks ran in convoys, each separated by precise distances to prevent catastrophic pileups, their drivers pushing beyond exhaustion in shifts that sometimes extended 24 hours or more. The route itself stretched from supply depots in Normandy, initially at St. Lo and Utah Beach, later expanded to include Cherbourg, all the way to forward distribution points that moved steadily eastward as Allied armies advanced. At its peak, the express covered a round trip of over 700 miles, and the regulations demanded that trucks maintain minimum speeds of 25 miles per hour, a pace that seemed impossible on war-damaged roads, through territories still contested by German raiders, across bridges hastily repaired by combat engineers working under fire. But the most remarkable aspect of the Red Ball Express, the detail that German intelligence either dismissed or never fully grasped, was its drivers. Approximately 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were Black American soldiers, men who faced discrimination and segregation in their own army, but who now found themselves entrusted with the mission that would determine whether the Allied advance continued or collapsed. They came from quartermaster companies, trucking battalions, and port operations, units that had been consigned to support roles not because they lacked capability, but because American military policy in 1944 still reflected the prejudices of Jim Crow society. These were men who had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that their role in winning the war was to support white combat troops, to serve but not to lead, to contribute but not to shine. Yet now they were given a mission that demanded everything they had: skill, courage, endurance, and a willingness to die for an army and a nation that had not yet granted them full citizenship or equality. And they performed miracles. The German generals had expected weakness. They had calculated that American logistics would fail because they believed American soldiers, particularly Black American soldiers, lacked the discipline and commitment necessary for sustained operations under pressure. It was a miscalculation rooted in ideology as much as military analysis, a fatal confusion of prejudice with strategic assessment. What they discovered instead was that determination could not be measured by skin color or pre-war social status, and that men fighting for a promise of freedom, even freedom not yet fully realized, could find reserves of strength that comfortable assumptions could never predict. The Red Ball Express drivers faced conditions that would have justified retreat, delay, or failure. They drove trucks that broke down constantly, vehicles pushed beyond their design limits on roads that tore at tires and suspensions with every mile. They drove through territories where German troops still operated, where Luftwaffe fighters occasionally strafed convoys, where the war was not safely behind them, but all around them. They drove through exhaustion so profound that drivers fell asleep at the wheel, through weather that turned roads into rivers of mud, through mechanical failures that required field repairs with inadequate tools and improvised parts. And they drove, knowing that their success or failure would determine whether Patton's advance continued, whether German armies could be destroyed before winter, whether the war might end in 1944 or drag into 1945 and beyond. Private William Scott of the 3883rd Quartermaster Truck Company remembered those days in testimony recorded decades later, his words carrying the weight of experience no training manual could capture. "We drove all day and all night," he said. "When your truck broke down, you fixed it on the side of the road, or you caught a ride with the next convoy and came back for it. There was no stopping. The front needed supplies, and we were going to get them there. We didn't think about whether we could do it. We just did it." His words captured something essential about the Red Ball Express. It succeeded not because of careful planning or elegant systems, but because thousands of individual drivers made the choice, mile after mile, day after day, to keep going when every physical and practical reason argued for stopping. This was not the precision of German logistics, with its careful calculations and systematic approaches. This was American abundance married to American determination, a willingness to overwhelm problems with sheer effort and resources that seemed inexhaustible. The symbol of this abundance, the physical manifestation of American industrial might that haunted German strategic thinking, was the jerry can. The 5-gallon gasoline container became the recurring image of Red Ball Express operations, the object that appeared in every photograph, every memory, every calculation of success and failure. Each truck carried dozens of them, their distinctive shape and khaki paint marking them as vessels of American mobility. The jerrycan, ironically a German innovation that Allied forces had copied and improved, became in American hands something more than a container. It represented the fundamental difference between Allied and Axis logistics, between abundance and scarcity, between a war effort powered by the world's greatest industrial economy and one struggling to fuel operations with declining resources and collapsing infrastructure. Each jerrycan that reached Patton's tanks represented a small victory in the larger war of supply, a gasoline drop in an ocean of fuel that American refineries pumped out in quantities that made German petroleum engineers despair. The Germans had calculated that fuel shortages would stop the American advance. They had not calculated that America could produce petroleum faster than Patton could consume it, that the bottleneck was transportation rather than supply, and that American determination would solve the transportation problem through sheer force of will. By September 1944, the impact of the Red Ball Express on military operations had become impossible for German commanders to ignore or explain away. Patton's Third Army, which should have ground to a halt somewhere in central France, was approaching the German border. American armor was operating at distances from supply bases that German doctrine considered impossible, and yet fuel continued to flow, ammunition continued to arrive, and the advance continued with a momentum that seemed supernatural. German intelligence officers filed reports that their superiors initially dismissed as exaggeration or error. How could American trucks be running 24 hours per day? How could they maintain such speed on damaged roads? How could drivers operate under conditions that would have required rest and rotation by any rational standard? The reports persisted, and eventually the German High Command was forced to confront a truth that undermined their comfortable assumptions about American military incompetence. The Americans had not overcome the logistics problem through brilliant planning or efficient systems. They had overwhelmed it through abundance and determination, through a willingness to throw resources and human effort at a problem until the problem ceased to exist. It was not elegant, but it was devastatingly effective. The transformation in German strategic thinking came gradually, reluctantly, like a man forced to acknowledge a truth that destroys his understanding of the world. By October 1944, as Allied armies closed on the German border and the Red Ball Express continued its relentless operations, German generals began to grasp the full implications of what they were witnessing. This was not simply about trucks and gasoline. This was about two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, two different philosophies of military organization and national purpose. German logistics had been built on the assumption of scarcity, on the need to carefully manage limited resources across multiple fronts, on the understanding that efficiency was survival and waste was death. It had created brilliant systems, elegant solutions to complex problems, tactical innovations that maximized the impact of every tank, every shell, every gallon of fuel. But it had also created brittle structures that shattered under strain, armies that could not absorb losses or adapt to setbacks, a war machine that excelled in controlled conditions but struggled when confronted with chaos. American logistics, by contrast, embraced chaos. It accepted waste as the price of speed, redundancy as the cost of reliability, abundance as strategy rather than luxury. The Red Ball Express embodied this philosophy in its purest form. It was inefficient by German standards, consuming vast quantities of fuel to deliver fuel, requiring thousands of trucks to support operations that German planning suggested should need hundreds. But it worked. It worked because American industry could produce trucks faster than wear, and combat could destroy them. Because American refineries could pump gasoline faster than armies could burn it. Because American determination could find drivers willing to push beyond exhaustion when the mission demanded it. The German generals had mocked American logistics because they had confused their own limitations with universal truths, had assumed that their experience of scarcity defined the boundaries of possibility for all nations. They had not understood that America was fighting a different war, one where the constraints were not resources but will, not supply but distribution, not capacity but courage. Lieutenant General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff of Army Group G, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the moment when this realization crystallized for German commanders. "We had calculated everything," he wrote, "except the possibility that our enemy would simply refuse to accept the limitations that logistics imposed on all previous wars." The Americans did not solve the supply problem. They ignored it. They drove trucks until they broke and then drove them some more. They consumed fuel at rates that should have been unsustainable, and somehow sustained them anyway. It was not military art. It was American abundance applied to warfare, and we had no answer for it. His words carried the bitter recognition of a professional soldier forced to acknowledge that professionalism alone could not overcome material superiority when that superiority was wielded with sufficient determination. The Red Ball Express had become more than a logistics operation. It had become proof of concept for a way of war that Germany could not match. War by abundance, war by industrial supremacy, war by sheer overwhelming force applied with American directness and stubbornness. The human cost of this achievement was measured not in dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but in the grinding accumulation of exhausted miles, sleepless nights, and bodies pushed beyond their limits. Red Ball Express drivers did not face the immediate drama of infantry combat, but they faced death nonetheless, in highway accidents that claimed hundreds of lives, in German air attacks that occasionally caught convoys in the open, in breakdowns that stranded isolated trucks in territories still contested by enemy troops. They faced the slower death of exhaustion, the kind that killed through accumulated sleep deprivation and stress that wore down bodies and minds until mistakes became inevitable. Sergeant Thomas Campbell of the 3rd Armored Division Supply Units, a white soldier who worked alongside Red Ball Express convoys, wrote in letters home about what he witnessed. "These boys drive like their lives depend on it," he wrote in September 1944, "because other boys' lives do depend on it. Every gallon of gas they deliver is another mile Patton can advance. Every crate of ammunition is another German position we can destroy. They know this, and it drives them, harder than any officer ever could." The irony was not lost on the drivers themselves, black soldiers, risking their lives to advance. An army that would not allow them to serve in integrated units, supporting a war for democracy and freedom that their own nation had not yet fully extended to them. They drove past French civilians who greeted them as liberators without regard to skin color, through towns where gratitude was universal and discrimination absent, knowing that when they returned home, segregation and Jim Crow laws would still govern much of American life. Yet they drove with pride and determination nonetheless because the mission mattered, because their brothers in arms, black and white, needed those supplies, because they were proving something important about capability and courage and equality, through actions that no words could refute. Private Robert Johnson of the 514th Quartermaster Truck Company captured this complex pride in an interview conducted decades later. "We knew we were good at what we did," he said. "We knew the Army needed us even if they didn't want to admit it. Every time we delivered supplies on time, every time we kept the convoys rolling when they said it couldn't be done, we were proving something. Not just to the white officers or the Germans, but to ourselves. We were as good as anybody, and we were proving it mile by mile." The jerry cans became their symbol, their medal of honor, their proof of achievement. Each one delivered was a small victory, each convoy that reached its destination a battle won. They did not carry weapons into combat, but they carried the means of combat, the fuel that powered tanks, the ammunition that fed artillery, the rations that sustained infantry. Without them, Patton's advance would have faltered. Without them, the German army might have stabilized defensive lines that could have prolonged the war into 1946 or beyond. Without them, Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, the drive toward the Rhine, the eventual crossing into Germany itself, all of these might have been delayed or derailed by logistical constraints that had crippled offensives throughout military history. The Red Ball Express drivers did not storm beaches or capture cities, but they made those victories possible, and in doing so, they demonstrated that logistics was not the unglamorous backwater of warfare, but its fundamental foundation, and that those who mastered logistics controlled the pace and possibility of modern war. By November 1944, when the Red Ball Express officially ceased dedicated operations, its mission accomplished, its routes integrated into the broader Allied supply network as front lines stabilized near the German border, it had moved enough supplies to fuel the liberation of France and the approach to Germany itself. The statistics were staggering. 12,193 tons of supplies transported over 83 days, representing an average of 89 trucks per hour, rolling through Red Ball routes at the operation's peak. But the statistics could not capture the human dimension of what had been achieved. The accumulated courage of thousands of drivers who had worked beyond exhaustion, the quiet heroism of men who had faced death by accident and enemy action, without the recognition that combat troops received, the pride of black soldiers who had proven their capability under conditions that would have justified failure. The Red Ball Express succeeded not because of brilliant planning or efficient systems, though planning and organization certainly mattered. It succeeded because American soldiers, particularly black, American soldiers who had been given few opportunities to prove themselves in combat roles, had taken an impossible mission and made it possible through determination, skill, and a refusal to accept failure. The German generals who had mocked American logistics learned their lesson, though the learning came too late to alter the war's outcome. In prisoner of war interrogations and post-war debriefings, captured German officers repeatedly returned to the Red Ball Express as a symbol of why they had lost, why all their tactical brilliance and operational excellence could not overcome the fundamental imbalance in resources and national commitment. They had assumed that warfare was about efficiency, about doing more with less, about tactical brilliance overcoming material disadvantage. The Americans had demonstrated that modern warfare was ultimately about abundance, about having so much that efficiency became optional, about industrial capacity so vast that it could overwhelm any defense through sheer weight of supply. One captured German logistics officer interrogated in December 1944 put it simply, We counted on your supplies running out. They never did. We counted on your trucks breaking down. You just brought more trucks. We counted on your drivers giving up. They never stopped. How do you fight an enemy that refuses to be defeated by logistics? The answer, of course, was that you could not. The Red Ball Express had changed the calculus of modern warfare, had demonstrated that in a conflict between industrial democracies and resource-constrained dictatorships, abundance was strategy and determination was tactics. It had proven that the soft Americans, the shopkeepers and factory workers that German generals had dismissed, could work harder and drive farther and push through more adversity than Prussian discipline had thought possible. It had shown that pride and purpose could overcome exhaustion, that soldiers fighting for a promise of equality, even equality not yet fully realized, could find reserves of strength that comfortable privilege could never match. The Red Ball Express was about trucks and gasoline and tonnage statistics, but it was also about something more fundamental, the capacity of free men, even men not yet fully free, to achieve the impossible when the cause was just and the need was urgent. Patton himself, whose advance the Red Ball Express had sustained, understood what had been accomplished, though his understanding came slowly and his public recognition came late. A general known for his impatience with logistics, his demand that supplies simply appear when needed regardless of practical constraints. Patton gradually came to appreciate that his Third Army's spectacular advance across France had been possible only because of drivers he had never seen, men who had worked in conditions he had never witnessed, soldiers whose names would never appear in history books next to his own. In a letter to his wife written in November 1944, he acknowledged what he had come to understand. The newspapers write about my tanks and my victories, and they should write about the boys who got the gasoline to those tanks. Without them, we would still be sitting in Normandy. It was perhaps the closest the general came to genuine humility, and it reflected a truth that the entire American military establishment was slowly, reluctantly beginning to accept, that the support troops, the logistics personnel, the men who moved supplies rather than captured territory, were as essential to victory as the most decorated combat units. This realization would have profound implications for the American military in the decades that followed World War II. The Red Ball Express became a case study in military logistics courses, a proof of concept for the massive supply operations that would characterize American military interventions, from Korea to Vietnam to the Persian Gulf and beyond. It established patterns and expectations that would define American warfare. The assumption that supplies would always be available, that logistics could be solved through resources and determination, that no advance need halt for want of fuel or ammunition, as long as American industry and American drivers could sustain the flow. But it also established something more important. Though the recognition would come slowly and incompletely, it demonstrated that black soldiers could perform any military mission as competently as white soldiers, that segregation weakened rather than strengthened American military power, that the nation's commitment to equality and democracy was incomplete, as long as the men who defended those principles were denied their full benefits. The transformation would take years, would require continued pressure from civil rights activists and military leaders who recognized that segregation was both morally wrong and militarily inefficient. But the Red Ball Express provided evidence that could not be dismissed or ignored, performance that could not be explained away by prejudice or convenient assumptions. Those drivers had proven something important on the roads of France in 1944, and their proof would echo through American military and social history for decades. They had demonstrated that courage and capability were not products of race or privilege but of opportunity and necessity, that black soldiers given the chance to prove themselves would excel, that the nation that denied equal opportunity to its own citizens was betraying its founding principles and weakening its own defense. The lesson was clear even if its acceptance was slow. The men of the Red Ball Express had not simply moved supplies across France. They had moved American society inch by hard-fought inch toward the equality that the Constitution promised and history demanded. In the autumn twilight of October 1944, as the Red Ball Express rolled toward its eventual conclusion, a young black driver named James Walker sat in his truck during a brief maintenance stop on the outskirts of a liberated French village. He was 22 years old, exhausted beyond measure, his hands blistered from the steering wheel and his eyes burning from too many hours on the road. But he was also in that moment quietly proud. The villagers had brought food and wine to the convoy, had thanked the drivers in broken English and eloquent French, had treated them as liberators without regard to the color of their uniforms or their skin. An old woman had pressed a bottle of wine into his hands and kissed both his cheeks, tears streaming down her weathered face, and she had said in French that he and his brothers had saved France. He did not speak French, but he understood the gratitude, understood that in this place, at this moment, he was judged not by the prejudices of Jim Crow, but by the content of his actions and the courage of his service. He looked at his fellow drivers, black men and the occasional white officer, all of them united by exhaustion and purpose, and he understood that they were writing history in diesel smoke and accumulated miles, proving something important that their nation needed to learn. The jerry cans in his truck bed caught the last light of the setting sun, their khaki paint glowing briefly golden before fading to shadow. Each one represented miles yet to drive, tanks yet to fuel, battles yet to fight. Each one represented abundance, American abundance, industrial abundance, the abundance of a nation that could produce supplies faster than armies could consume them. But they represented something more as well, something the German generals had never understood in their calculations and contempt. They represented freedom, the freedom to work toward a better future, the freedom to prove oneself through action, the freedom that black soldiers were defending abroad while fighting for it at home. They represented democracy, imperfect, incomplete, sometimes hypocritical, but real nonetheless, a system that could learn and change and grow toward its stated ideals. They represented possibility, the possibility that men of any color or background could achieve anything if given the chance, the possibility that America might someday fulfill its promise of equality for all citizens, the possibility that the war being fought for freedom in Europe might also advance freedom in America. The sun set over France, and the convoy prepared to roll again. Walker climbed back into his truck, started the engine with the practiced ease of thousands of repetitions, and pulled into line with the endless procession of vehicles stretching toward the horizon. Behind him lay the beaches of Normandy, the depots of liberation, the miles already conquered. Ahead lay the German border, the Rhine crossing, the final battles that would end the European war. Between those points lay hundreds of miles of road, thousands of jerry cans to deliver, countless convoys to complete before the mission was done. The German generals had calculated that American logistics would fail. They had mocked the soft Americans, dismissed their capability, assumed that abundance could not overcome the fundamental constraints that had governed warfare throughout history. They had been wrong, not because American logistics was elegant or efficient, not because American planning was superior or American soldiers more disciplined, but because American determination, particularly the determination of black soldiers, fighting for a nation that had not yet granted them equality, could overcome any obstacle that will and resources could defeat. The Red Ball Express rolled on through the gathering darkness, its headlights cutting through the night like searchlights illuminating truth. It rolled toward victory, toward the liberation of Europe, toward the end of the Nazi regime and the defeat of fascism, but it also rolled toward something else, something less tangible but equally important. It rolled toward justice, toward the recognition that black soldiers had earned through service and sacrifice, toward the slow transformation of American society that would eventually, decades later, fulfill some of the promises that men like James Walker had fought to defend. The road was long and the journey was far from over. But on that October evening in 1944, as the Red Ball Express continued its relentless advance, the direction was clear. The American way of war, abundance applied with determination, resources wielded with purpose, logistics transformed into strategy, had proven its worth on the roads of France. And the American promise of equality, still unfulfilled but undeniable in its power, had found new champions among the drivers who had kept Patton's army rolling toward Berlin. In the end, that was what the German generals had failed to understand, what their calculations and contempt had blinded them to. They had mocked American logistics because they saw only systems and supplies, trucks and tonnage, the mechanical aspects of warfare that could be quantified and compared. They had not seen the human spirit that animated those systems, the determination that kept drivers on the road when exhaustion demanded rest, the pride that pushed men to excel when prejudice expected failure. They had not understood that free men, even men not yet fully free, fight differently than conscripts and fanatics, that soldiers defending democracy, however imperfect, find reserves of strength that ideology alone cannot match. The Red Ball Express was about moving supplies, but it was also about moving history, about proving through action what words alone could never establish. It was about black soldiers demonstrating their equality through excellence, about American abundance overwhelming German efficiency, about democracy defeating dictatorship not just through military victory, but through the vindication of its fundamental principles. The jerrycans kept rolling, mile after mile, convoy after convoy, day after day. They carried gasoline, but they also carried hope. The hope that America might someday fully embrace the equality it proclaimed. The hope that service and sacrifice might earn the recognition that birth and privilege should never deny. The hope that the war for freedom abroad might also advance freedom at home. That hope sustained the drivers through their exhaustion and danger, through the long nights and endless roads, through the knowledge that their contribution would be forgotten or diminished by a society not yet ready to acknowledge what they had achieved. But history remembers and truth endures. The Red Ball Express succeeded where German calculations predicted failure, and in succeeding it changed the war and the world. That is the legacy, the truth that no prejudice can erase and no passing of years can diminish. The soft Americans, the dismissed and discounted, the black soldiers given their chance to prove themselves. They kept the supplies rolling, kept the armies advancing, kept the promise of freedom alive. And in the end, that made all the difference.